Life doesn't break you by accident, it breaks you on purpose. And what it forces you to face next changes everything. There comes a moment when distraction stops working. Success feels hollow, noise feels heavy, and silence, terrifying as it sounds, starts calling your name. This isn't burnout, it isn't weakness. It's life pulling you inward because the version of you built for survival can't carry you any further. As Carl G. Jung said, I was forced to examine the foundations of my being. And that force isn't punishment, it's initiation. In this video, you'll understand why life collapses your outer world to rebuild your inner one, why resistance only deepens the pain, and how introspection becomes the doorway to clarity, strength, and wholeness. What feels like losing yourself is actually the fastest path to reclaiming your real self. If you know how to listen, you're not falling behind. You're being called inward because something essential is ready to wake up. You don't usually notice the foundation of a house until it cracks. And the same goes for your life. When things start falling apart, it feels brutal, unfair, almost personal. One day you're running on autopilot, chasing approval, validation, success, and the next, boom, everything pauses. That pause isn't random, it's life forcing introspection, pulling you away from noise so you can finally hear yourself think. This is where transformation begins, not with motivation, but with disruption. It's uncomfortable, yeah, but it's also honest. The collapse isn't here to destroy you. It's here to show you what was never solid in the first place. Think about it like this. If a bridge collapses, engineers don't cry over the ruins. They study them. You're being invited to do the same with your identity. When routines break, relationships shift, or purpose feels blurry, your psyche is signaling that something deeper needs attention. You might call it burnout, confusion, or even failure, but underneath, it's awakening. The self starts whispering when the world stops shouting, and suddenly questions you've avoided about meaning, wholeness, and direction refuse to stay quiet. That's not weakness, that's awareness knocking. Here's the tricky part. Most people rush to rebuild too fast. Same habits, new packaging, same patterns, different names. But real introspection asks you to slow down and sit with the rubble. Ask yourself what actually worked and what only looked good from the outside. For example, if your sense of worth collapsed with a job loss, that's a sign your identity was outsourced. This is the moment to invest inward, journaling nightly, reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, or simply walking without headphones and letting your thoughts surface. Small actions, big clarity. Emotionally, this phase can feel lonely. You might feel disconnected, unsure, even restless. That's normal. When the old self dissolves, the new one hasn't fully formed yet. It's like standing between tides. No solid ground, just trust. But here's the secret. Solitude isn't empty. It's fertile. This is where shadow elements emerge, where ignored desires and suppressed truths ask for integration. Instead of pushing them away, observe them. Curiosity softens fear. And slowly, piece by piece, your inner structure starts reorganizing itself. What's powerful is that once the collapse does its job, you start seeing life differently. You stop confusing busyness with meaning and approval with selfhood. There's a subtle shift, less urgency, more depth. You're no longer chasing every signal from the outside world. You're listening inward, recalibrating, and just as you begin to sense that something essential is being uncovered, something raw, something real, you realize this collapse wasn't the event. It was the doorway. Because once the core is exposed, another question inevitably rises. What happens when the world you relied on stops working altogether? At first, the inner call doesn't arrive politely. It interrupts, it nags, it shows up at inconvenient hours, late at night, early in the morning, in the quiet moments you used to fill with noise. You try to scroll past it, drown it out, stay busy, but it won't let you. This is introspection turning up the volume because subtlety didn't work. Life isn't whispering anymore, it's insisting. And deep down, you know this isn't anxiety or restlessness for no reason. It's meaning asking for your attention. This call often disguises itself as discomfort, a strange dissatisfaction, a feeling that something's off, even when things look fine on paper. You might be doing everything right, career, relationships, routines, and still feel hollow. That's the psyche pulling you inward, away from borrowed goals and inherited definitions of success. Awakening rarely feels like light at first. It feels like friction, like wearing shoes that don't fit anymore. The irritation is the message, and once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. Here's where many people panic. They label the feeling as a problem to fix instead of a signal to follow. But what if, instead of numbing it, you listened? Practically speaking, this might mean creating intentional silence. 10 minutes of stillness each morning, no phone, no input. Or writing one honest page answering a single question. What am I avoiding feeling right now? Books like The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho or Jung's own reflections can act as mirrors, not manuals. They don't give answers, they sharpen your questions. Emotionally, this stage can feel destabilizing. Old motivations lose their grip. External validation stops working the way it used to. And that's scary, because the familiar, even when limiting, feels safe. But this is where transformation quietly takes root. You begin sensing that your worth isn't tied to performance, that your identity isn't a role you play, but something alive, evolving. The inner call isn't asking you to abandon your life. It's asking you to inhabit it more truthfully. As you start responding to this call, even in small ways, something shifts. You become less reactive, more attentive, less driven by noise, more guided by intuition. And that's when you notice something unsettling but revealing. The outer world you once leaned on feels less reliable. Structures that supported you start wobbling, certainties dissolve, which leads to an unavoidable realization. If the world outside no longer holds you steady, what happens when it completely stops working for you? There comes a moment when you realize the old rules don't apply anymore. What used to motivate you barely moves the needle. The praise, the goals, the routines, they still exist, but they've lost their power. It feels unsettling, like trying to start a car that suddenly won't turn over. This is usually when people say, "I don't know what's wrong with me," but nothing's wrong. This is introspection deepening. Life is withdrawing its usual rewards, so you're forced to look inward instead of outward. Think of it like a video game that quietly changes difficulty levels without warning. The strategies that once worked now fail. You push harder, try more, stay busier, and still feel stuck. That's because the game isn't asking for effort anymore, it's asking for awareness. Awakening often begins when control stops delivering results. The psyche isn't impressed by hustle, it responds to honesty, and the moment you admit this isn't working anymore, something inside you exhales. Practically, this phase invites a different kind of action. Less doing, more observing. Instead of forcing outcomes, you start tracking patterns. Notice what drains you versus what quietly energizes you. For example, if constant social interaction leaves you empty, experiment with intentional solitude once or twice a week. If your job feels meaningless, don't quit impulsively. Start by reading Deep Work by Cal Newport or Man's Search for Meaning. These aren't escapes, they're lenses that sharpen perception. Emotionally, this stage can trigger fear. When external structures fail, the mind scrambles for certainty. You might feel impatient, restless, or tempted to recreate old versions of yourself just to feel stable again. But stability built on denial always cracks. This is where identity begins to loosen, not as a loss, but as an upgrade. The self starts reorganizing, shedding outdated definitions. You're not breaking down, You're being reconfigured. As the outer world loses its grip, something subtle happens inside you. You stop chasing answers and start tolerating questions. That tolerance creates space, and in that space, deeper layers surface. Fears you never named, desires you postponed, contradictions you ignored. It's uncomfortable, yes, but it's also real. And once you step into that honesty, you're inevitably pulled further inward, straight into the parts of yourself you've avoided meeting for years. Going inward isn't a spa retreat. It's more like turning on the lights in a room you've avoided for years. At first it's jarring. You notice the clutter, the dust, the things shoved into corners. This is introspection at its most honest. When the outer world quiets down, the inner world gets louder, and not always in pleasant ways. Old fears resurface. Regrets tap you on the shoulder. But this discomfort isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's proof you've stopped running. Most people believe growth should feel empowering from the start, but real awakening often feels destabilizing. You begin seeing your contradictions clearly, strength mixed with insecurity, kindness alongside resentment, ambition tangled with fear. And instead of fixing them immediately, you're asked to witness them. Think of it like holding a mirror instead of a hammer. The psyche doesn't need punishment, it needs recognition. What you acknowledge begins to soften. What you resist only tightens its grip. Here's a practical way to navigate this phase without getting lost in it. Name what you feel, literally. When anxiety shows up, don't just say, "I'm stressed." Ask, "What exactly am I afraid of losing?" Write it down. If anger appears, trace it backward. Is it grief? Is it a boundary you never set? Simple practices like shadow journaling or reading Jung-inspired reflections can bring clarity. This isn't about self-criticism. It's about self-integration. Emotionally, this stage can feel isolating because fewer people talk about it honestly. You might smile in public and wrestle privately, but this is where depth is forged. The parts of you that were pushed aside now ask for a seat at the table. The shadow isn't a monster, it's unfinished business, and when you allow it into awareness, something surprising happens. Energy returns. You feel more whole, less fragmented, less like you're performing, more like you're becoming. As you sit with these uncomfortable truths, your tolerance for superficiality fades. Small talk feels thinner. Old distractions lose their shine. You're not becoming cold, you're becoming selective. And just as you start sensing a strange clarity forming beneath the discomfort, another realization creeps in. To fully step into this new self, something old will have to die. Not physically, but symbolically. And that death carries a weight most people aren't prepared for. At some point, solitude stops feeling accidental and starts feeling intentional. You're not avoiding people, you're being pulled away. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. This is where introspection matures. Solitude becomes less about being alone and more about being undistracted. No audience, no performance, just you and the quiet truth of who you are when no one's watching. And oddly enough, that silence begins to feel less empty and more honest. Think of solitude like a deep sea dive. On the surface, everything's loud and chaotic, but the deeper you go, the quieter it gets and the clearer things become. In isolation, borrowed opinions lose their grip. You start noticing which thoughts are truly yours and which ones you absorbed without question. Awakening thrives here. The psyche finally has space to reorganize itself without interruption. And yes, it can feel uncomfortable at first, like withdrawal from constant stimulation. That discomfort is recalibration. Practically speaking, solitude doesn't mean disappearing from the world. It means creating deliberate pockets of stillness. A solo walk without music, a Sunday morning with no plans, reading something slow and reflective, meditations by Marcus Aurelius or Jung's writings, rather than consuming endless content. Even 10 minutes a day of sitting quietly, noticing your breath and thoughts, trains your nervous system to tolerate presence. These small rituals build inner stability in ways external structure never could. Emotionally, solitude exposes truths you've been postponing. Feelings you diluted with distraction now arrive undiluted. Loneliness, grief, longing, they all surface. But here's the paradox. When you stop running from these emotions, they soften. You realize solitude isn't abandonment, it's initiation. It teaches you self-trust. You begin relying less on constant reassurance and more on inner authority. The self stops outsourcing validation and starts generating it internally. As solitude reshapes you, something subtle changes in how you relate to others. You're less reactive, less needy, less eager to fill space with noise. You listen differently, you speak with more intention, and that's when you notice a deeper shift forming beneath the quiet. The person you used to be, the one built on adaptation and survival, no longer fits. A shedding is coming, not dramatic, but irreversible. And that shedding carries the unmistakable weight of an ending. There's a quiet moment when you realize you can't go back, not because you don't want to, but because the old version of you no longer fits. This is the symbolic death no one warns you about. It doesn't arrive with drama, it arrives with clarity. You notice the masks slipping, the habits feeling foreign, the goals losing meaning. Introspection reaches a point where pretending becomes exhausting. And that exhaustion, it's a signal. Something outdated is ready to be released. Most people fear this phase because it feels like loss. You grieve the person you were certain you needed to be, the achiever, the pleaser, the strong one, the reliable one. Awakening asks you to mourn identities that once protected you, but now confine you. Think of it like shedding a skin that kept you alive through winter but suffocates you in spring. The grief isn't weakness. It's respect for who you were while making space for who you're becoming. Practically, this death shows up in subtle choices. You stop forcing conversations that drain you. You say no without over-explaining. You question commitments that no longer align. A powerful exercise here is to list the roles you've played for survival and ask which ones are still necessary. Reading something like The Untethered Soul can help loosen identification with old narratives. This isn't about erasing your past, it's about unbinding from it. Emotionally, this phase feels tender. You might feel exposed, undefined, even invisible at times. That's because identity is dissolving faster than a new one can form. But here's the truth. This emptiness isn't a void, it's a womb. The psyche needs space to reorganize without interference. And in that space, something rare develops, self-trust. You begin acting from alignment instead of obligation, from truth instead of habit. As the old self fades, you notice a strange calm underneath the grief. Less inner conflict, fewer mental negotiations. You're not trying to prove anything anymore. And just when you start sensing that this inner clearing is making room for something sturdier, something quieter, something real, you realize the next challenge isn't letting go. It's facing what you've been avoiding all along, because what dies creates a shadow. And that shadow is waiting to be met. There's a part of you that learned early how to stay hidden. Not because it was evil, but because it wasn't welcome. This is the shadow, the emotions, impulses, and truths you pushed aside to survive, belong, or be loved. When introspection deepens, this part doesn't stay quiet anymore. It doesn't attack. It asks. It wants recognition. Awakening reaches a turning point here, because ignoring the shadow no longer works. What was once buried now wants to be integrated. Most people misunderstand the shadow. They think it's only anger, envy, or selfishness. But it also contains creativity, assertiveness, vulnerability, qualities you were taught were too much or not enough. Think of it like a locked room in your house. You avoided it for years, assuming it was dangerous. But when you finally open the door, you don't find a monster. You find forgotten parts of yourself waiting patiently. The fear came from imagination, not reality. Practically, shadow integration starts with observation, not correction. When you judge someone harshly, pause and ask, what part of me reacts so strongly to this? When you feel disproportionate anger, trace it backward. What boundary was crossed? Simple exercises help. Write a list of traits you dislike in others, then circle the ones you secretly suppress in yourself. Reading Jung's reflections or books like Owning Your Own Shadow can give language to what you're experiencing. Awareness is the medicine here. Emotionally, meeting the shadow can feel humbling. You see sides of yourself that don't match your self-image, but something liberating happens when you stop fighting them. Energy returns. You feel less fragmented, less tense. The psyche relaxes when all parts are allowed at the table. Wholeness isn't about being good, it's about being honest, and honesty builds inner authority faster than perfection ever could. As integration unfolds, you notice a subtle but powerful shift. You react less defensively, you're harder to manipulate. You're more grounded in your choices. The shadow no longer hijacks your behavior from the background. It becomes a source of strength and clarity. And just when this inner alignment starts stabilizing you, another realization surfaces. Now that you're more whole inside, the way you build your life on the outside can no longer stay the same. After everything you've stripped away, something surprising happens. You don't feel lost, you feel lighter. This is where rebuilding begins, but not the way you were taught. Not from ambition, not from pressure, not from comparison. This rebuilding starts quietly, from the inside out. Introspection has cleared the noise. Awakening has recalibrated your compass. And now, instead of asking, how do I succeed? You start asking what actually matters to me. That question changes everything. Before, your life may have been structured around validation, titles, approval, productivity. Now values take the lead. Meaning replaces urgency. Think of it like renovating a house after discovering the foundation was cracked. You don't rush to decorate, you reinforce what holds everything up. The psyche craves coherence, not applause. And when your actions align with your inner truth, effort feels cleaner, less forced. You stop performing life and start participating in it. Practically, this shows up in small but decisive shifts. You choose depth over speed. You invest time where energy returns instead of leaks. Maybe you redesign your mornings, reading a few pages of Atomic Habits or journaling before checking your phone. Maybe you reassess work, not asking, does this impress? But does this respect my values? Even finances, relationships, and routines begin aligning differently. These aren't dramatic changes, they're deliberate ones. Emotionally, rebuilding feels steadier than the earlier phases. There's less chaos, more intention. You trust yourself more because you've seen what happens when everything else falls away, and you're still standing. The self is no longer reactive, it's responsive. You're not trying to control life anymore, you're cooperating with it. That cooperation creates resilience. When challenges appear, they don't shatter you, they inform you. As your outer life slowly reorganizes around inner clarity, you notice something profound. You're no longer chasing direction. Direction is emerging naturally. Decisions feel quieter but firmer. And just when this new structure starts feeling solid, another layer reveals itself. An inner voice that no longer asks for permission. A sense of authority that doesn't need to dominate or explain. Because rebuilding wasn't the final step, it was preparation for ownership. Inner authority doesn't arrive with confident speeches or dramatic breakthroughs. It's quieter than that. almost unnoticeable at first. One day you realize you're no longer asking everyone what they think before you decide. You pause, check in with yourself, and move. That's introspection maturing into self-trust. Awakening stops being an experience and becomes a way of operating. You don't feel louder, you feel steadier, and that steadiness changes how you move through the world. Before, your choices might have been shaped by approval, fear, or urgency. Now, there's a subtle internal filter. Not perfection, alignment. Think of it like tuning an instrument. When something's off, you feel it immediately. Conversations, opportunities, commitments, they either resonate or they don't. And you stop forcing resonance where it doesn't exist. The psyche no longer negotiates with what violates your values. This isn't rigidity, it's clarity. Practically, inner authority shows up in simple, almost boring ways. You say no faster and yes slower. You don't over-explain your boundaries. You choose fewer things and commit to them fully. For example, instead of chasing 10 goals, you focus on one that feels meaningful and sustainable. You might replace constant consumption with intentional input, rereading a chapter instead of scrolling endlessly, or revisiting Think and Grow Rich with new eyes, noticing how mindset shapes outcome. Emotionally, this phase feels grounded. You're less reactive to criticism and less intoxicated by praise. Neither defines you anymore. That's freedom. You don't need to dominate, convince, or perform. Your presence does the work. The self feels unified instead of fragmented. The shadow no longer hijacks decisions. The inner voice doesn't shout, it guides. And the more you trust it, the clearer it becomes. As this authority settles in, something interesting happens. You re-enter situations that once triggered you, but now they don't hold the same power. You're the same person on the outside, but internally, the axis has shifted. Life doesn't push you around the way it used to, and just when this inner leadership feels established, another challenge appears, not about who you are, but how you return to the world carrying this new depth. At some point, life invites you back in, not as the same person, but as someone rearranged from the inside. You return to conversations, work, relationships, routines. Everything looks familiar, yet nothing feels the same. That's because introspection has shifted your center of gravity. You're no longer moving from reaction or hunger. You're moving from intention. Awakening doesn't pull you away from the world forever. It teaches you how to re-enter without losing yourself. Before, the world shaped you more than you shaped your responses to it. Now there's a pause between stimulus and action. Think of it like learning to surf instead of fighting the waves. You don't try to control everything. You learn timing, balance, direction. The psyche becomes flexible, not fragile. Challenges still come, but they don't hijack your identity. You experience life instead of being consumed by it. Practically, this return shows up in how you engage. You listen more than you perform. You choose your battles carefully. You invest energy where there's meaning, not just momentum. For example, instead of overcommitting socially, you protect your solitude during the week. Instead of chasing recognition at work, you focus on mastery and contribution. These aren't withdrawals from life, they're upgrades in how you participate in it. Emotionally, you feel less defensive and more present. You don't need to prove depth, you embody it. The world senses that. People may respond differently to you, some drawn in, others unsettled. That's normal. When you change internally, old dynamics can't survive unchanged. But this doesn't create isolation, it creates resonance. You begin attracting situations and relationships that meet you where you are now, not where you used to be. And here's the subtle truth most people miss. Returning to the world isn't the end of the inward journey. It's its continuation in motion. Every interaction becomes a mirror, every challenge a refinement. You don't graduate from introspection, you live it. And as you move forward with this quiet strength, one question lingers beneath everything you do. Not who should I be now, but how deeply am I willing to live what I already know? Everything you've heard here only matters if it moves you to act. Insight without application becomes another form of escape. So now, the real question isn't, what did you understand? It's, what are you going to do differently when this video ends? Look at your life honestly. Where are you still numbing instead of listening? Where are you choosing comfort over truth? And what part of you has been asking, quietly, patiently, to finally be taken seriously? You don't need to change everything overnight. Start small, but start deliberately. Create space for solitude this week. Write one page without filters. Say one honest no, where you usually betray yourself with a yes. Pick one habit that brings clarity instead of noise. Transformation isn't dramatic, it's consistent. And every time you choose awareness over autopilot, you reinforce the person you're becoming. So ask yourself, if life forced you inward for a reason, what would it mean to honor that call instead of resisting it? If this message resonated with you, stay with us. Subscribe to Mind's Silent Echo, activate the notifications, and keep walking this path of depth, clarity, and inner authority. Because the inward journey doesn't end here, it deepens. And the more you listen, the more life starts to make sense.